I am in mourning because I lost my little Rupert, sweet little Chihuahua mix who had come from hoarding. He had so much PTSD when he came here that he was afraid to go outside. He was afraid of doors because I have a feeling he was slammed by a lot of doors in the 8 years that he spent in boarding before the place was invaded by the Tennessee State Police and the dogs were liberated and many of the little ones came to New York City where there seemed to be lots of homes for little dogs because most of us live in small spaces. And at first, it was a one-sided labor of love. But because dogs are so resilient, over time, he got in touch with his inner dog and he learned how to sniff and he learned what a toy was. And he became the most loving and caring being perhaps I've ever known. We were shocked when he had a diagnosis of lymphoma because he was only 11 or not even quite 11. But as I heard the wonderful writer Naomi, and I'm going to say her name wrong, maybe it's Green, Buddhist writer, she talked about her teachers saying that we always think that death comes in old age, but in truth, nobody knows when their death will come or when their dog's death will come. So I just want to show you Rupert for those of you who are on YouTube watching this and you're seeing all my other windows, but this is Rupert sleeping. His tongue hung out because he had no teeth, but it just made him all the cuter and more dapper and more wonderful. So he left us August 31st, 2025, and he lives in our hearts forever. Now, I tell you this because I am in grief, and that's a fact, but I also tell you this because of the subject of today's show. You are going to love this, and that's a promise. Hi, everybody. I am Victoria Moran, and this is the Main Street Vegan Podcast. Thank you so much for spending time with us today. And oh my gosh, at the end of this, you're going to be so grateful that you did. Because my guest is someone who rescued a dog from probably even a worse situation than Rupert came from. She rescued her dog, Hammy, from a laboratory situation, and it changed everything. I will tell you a little bit about my guest. Her name is Melanie Kaplan, and she is a longtime independent journalist whose travel and science writing has appeared in the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, and the National Parks Magazine. She's a graduate of Columbia Journalism School, a 2021-22 MIT Knight Science Journalism Fellow, and a third-generation Washington, D.C. native. She's lived most of her life with hounds. And she's written a book. She's written an incredible book with a very powerful title, Lab Dog. Not a phrase we hear often. We think of lab rat, it's bad enough. Lab mouse, bad enough. And lab dog, because we know dogs. The value of the mouse, the value of the rat is absolutely equal to the value of the dog. And yet, dogs are part of humanity, part of us in a really special way. So I am deeply honored to be welcoming Melanie Kaplan. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you. It's so nice to be here.
Well, it's wonderful to have you. Your book is so powerful. Your story is so powerful. And I know that a lot of my listeners, we're vegan, we're sensitive. It's like, oh, I want to read a book about a lab dog. Yes, you do. You want to read this one. You want to read this one because it is a redemption story. So, Melanie, take us back to the very beginning. How did you come to adopt a beagle, beagle who had been an experimental subject? And what did you know about animal testing before that?
Well, thank you, Victoria. And I am so sorry to hear about Rupert. I just want to say that I'm so glad I had a chance to meet him. I had lost another beagle named Darwin, and 3 years later, a friend of mine gave me a calendar from the Beagle Freedom Project, and the calendar was filled with pages of beagles who used to be in laboratories that had been rescued from the labs. And I thought, well, this is really interesting. I don't know anything about this topic, and I will foster one of these dogs. And you know how that goes with a foster. It did not take me long to decide. Well, I take that back. It took me longer than it might have. Hammy was very anxious when I adopted him. He was just so nervous going outside, and every sound and every movement scared him. And I love what you said about Rupert getting in touch with his inner dog. And Hammy did over time. He did learn to sniff. He learned to play. He learned to actually relax in the house after months and months. And when I adopted him, the organization, um, sent us home with a list of bullet points of things they wanted us to do, including introduce the dog to people and tell people that the dog came from research. And all I knew is that he was in some lab in Virginia, and he had a tattoo in his ear, which is typical for dogs and other animals that are in research to identify them because a lot of them don't have names in the labs. Some do. Hammy did. So for many years, I would just take Hammy out in the neighborhood and in our travels, and I would introduce him to people and say he was used for testing or research, and a lot of dogs, tens of thousands of dogs, are still used for this. And the response I got was just, as you can imagine, oh my gosh, this still happens, or this happens at all. And finally, I had one of my journalist friends say, "Is that still legal?" And and I couldn't really answer his question. I mean, I knew it was legal, but I didn't know anymore. And eventually I realized I had to dig into this because there were so many questions I didn't have answers to. And as a journalist, I'm curious and I want to understand things. And so I had this dog in my life for probably 8 years and then decided to start digging into this topic.
And what did you find?
um, well, you're right. It's a difficult topic for sure. I I think that my love for Hammy just kind of pushed me forward in my research. There were days when I had to just step aside because what we do to animals in labs is not something anybody wants to read about, and the industry doesn't want the public to know. And the fact is, even if it's the most benign experience for the animal in the lab, if they're not poked and prodded, if they're not given massive amounts of a drug or a chemical, which is what happens when they're testing drugs and chemicals on animals, including dogs, they are confined. They're in a cage or a kennel, and they can't experience the life that they should be experiencing, being a mouse or a rabbit or a ferret or a hedgehog or a pig. And that confinement really changes them. It's trauma.
Yes. So you brought him into your home. You completely changed his life. You completely gave him a life as a beloved dog. And yet, my sense is that he changed you too. I know he actually was instrumental in your becoming vegan. Can you tell us about that and some of the other changes?
Yes, he absolutely changed my life. This book would not exist without him, of course. So, one of the other bullet points on our list of things to do as adopters was to consider becoming vegan. And my trajectory on veganism has really been very slow. And, some people do it overnight after watching a documentary. Um, I don't think I was even aware of it growing up, but my sister became a vegetarian as a teenager, and that I'm sure planted a seed. And over the years, I stopped eating red meat and that, kept cutting things out of my diet. And then after I adopted Hammy, I just thought, well, let me just try this at home because it doesn't seem like it's that big of a shift from the way that I'm eating. And so I discovered all these wonderful grains and just ways to have a complete diet at home without without eating anything connected to animals. And that's been a great experience. I mean, that's probably going on 11 years now. And Hammy also, I'm sure, made me a more patient person because particularly in the early months and year and even later, when Hammy was triggered by some sound and he would just be trembling for a while, I really had to be patient. And it never felt like a chore, of course. This is what you do for somebody you love. But it just watching him go through this transformation and seeing him, you know, running around free at in a friend's backyard and seeing him decide where he wants to sleep at night and what he wants to eat and when he wants to eat it. It brought me so much joy because, I could see the change in him and of course it was changing me at the same time.
You were writing about him as part of your travel writing, and he was coming into your life, and people were learning about him before you really delved into what went on before he was in your life. What prompted you to be willing to look at all that?
There's a few things. I mean, first, I think probably just confidence as a writer is a big part of it, just understanding that I could take on this big of a topic. Although I never really felt that confident. It's still probably surprising to me that I did this. And then I just had some time. I had the pandemic during which I lost all of my freelance work. And then a year after that, I had a really bad concussion. So I wasn't doing much work at all for more than a year. And, we talk about how wonderful it is to have just downtime and to get to the point where you're feeling bored. And I think during that time, my brain was able to just, dream and imagine and fantasize about what I might want to do next. And it just became very clear to me that what I wanted to do next was tell the story of this little being that was at my side all the time, during the pandemic and during my healing and every other moment. And I also got a fellowship from the Night Science Journalism project at MIT, which was really instrumental because that gave me some grant money to really feel okay stopping freelancing for a time to kind of kick off the project.
So, as you did your research into what goes on in labs, I find that in my work as a vegan educator and when I'm training my vegan lifestyle coaches at Main Street Vegan Academy, one of the areas that's really a kind of hard to pin down is the cosmetic research on animals. And I
Mm.
really haven't heard of much of that in dogs. I know we're doing a lot less of it. I mean, years ago when I started, It was a huge deal, and we worked so hard on all the big companies to one at a time get them to stop, and then they'd stop, and then they'd want to sell to China where it's required. And they'd go, I mean, it's just so hard to follow and keep up, except that I know that you can walk into even the drugstore, and there are all kinds of cruelty-free personal care products. But then one of the things I learned in your book is that hand sanitizer, which was something we were just all using like crazy during the pandemic, and probably still now more than we were pre-pandemic, is tested on dogs. How do we, help us, help us.
I know. I wish I had a very clear answer to all this, but you were right. It's so complicated. And like you said, cosmetics, that started back in the 80s, and the big companies were dropping out of testing on animals, and it was a really big movement. Um, and I mean, think about it. Cosmetics is kind of a, it's an extra thing. It's something that we use to make ourselves beautiful, and it's not something for health. Um, and you can understand why these agencies like the FDA and the EPA testing chemicals want to be super careful, and they don't want lawsuits. They don't want people dying. They feel like they need to really test these chemicals. And the gold standard has been testing them on animals. So cosmetics, I tried to explain this to my mom, then I had to go back and re-clarify it with my subject matter experts. From what I understand, cosmetics have not been tested on animals in this country for decades. There could be some exceptions to that, but they definitely haven't been tested on dogs. And so I said, well, what about, I mean, why aren't all cosmetics labeled cruelty free? Because there's a lot that aren't. And what I was told is that there are still some loopholes. There are things tested in China. We don't know what they're doing. Some of these global companies are still selling to China or other countries that might be testing on animals. But you really can just limit your cosmetics purchases to cruelty free. That's pretty easy now. There's also some crossover products just to confuse things more, like anti um, anti-plaque toothpaste or anti-dandruff shampoo or sunscreen, and those those are considered drugs because they have things in them that um, the anti-dandruff is considered, maybe it's considered a medical thing or something. So those are tested differently from cosmetics. So when you buy anti-dandruff shampoo, um, that was tested on animals. So, and then the antimicrobial wipes, that is considered, I mean, that's a microbe, that's a living thing. And so a pesticide, the suffix "cide," CIDE, like suicide or genocide, that is something that kills. And like somebody told me, you can't have a gentle killer. And those are meant to kill. And we want to make sure that they're not killing the wrong things. We want to make sure they're not harming us, they're not causing cancer, they're not causing birth defects. But the the focus that's really been on animals is starting to shift to these non-animal alternatives or these new approach methods, which is really exciting.
That is exciting. And yet, there are still dogs, very often beagles, in these testing procedures. So, what are they being used for? Why beagles? And are there alternatives?
Yeah, the latest numbers we have, it's more than 40,000 dogs and labs, and most of them are beagles. And that is because they are sweet and docile and easy to work with, and they will do just about anything you ask. It also goes back historically because beagles were bred as hunting dogs, and so there were a lot of kennels that were breeding beagles to become better hunters. And so in the 50s, when labs started looking at dog diseases, they had these kennels of beagles that were ready to go for research and testing. And then they were used for radiation testing. And then they were used for pharmaceutical testing. And you had this system in place. They were breeding the beagles, they had the beagles, they were using the beagles. And so those are by far the majority of the breeds that are in research, but not the only ones. Um, so I lost my train of thought. What was the question?
That's okay. It just, I think you've really answered it. What are they testing? And you're saying pharmaceuticals and I guess surgical procedures in some instances and
Yes.
medical schools and that sort of thing. And yet there have been some big dog rescues from laboratories lately. So what started all of that? And is that how you got Hammy?
So I got Hammy before the Inviga rescue of 2022, when more than 4,000 beagles were rescued from the Inviga breeding facility in Virginia. And that situation was really sad. There were just a number of violations, animal welfare violations, and um, that were not being fixed. Dogs were dying, dogs were getting in fights and being euthanized for minor injuries. There were bugs in the food. They didn't have enough caretakers, and the veterinary care was not adequate. And so that happened over a few months in 2022. And right now, there's an investigation underway at Ridgeland Farms in Wisconsin because the there have been animal cruelty violations that are under investigation, and so there are people there actually this week in September talking about what will happen if we need to rescue a large number of beagles. And I just wanted to mention, you said something about medical schools. Fortunately, medical schools don't use any animals anymore for education, which is great. And that's been through a lot of hard work getting them to move over to simulations and models. Animals still are used in some of the specialty education, like trauma training and maybe some of the medical fellowships, but they're not used in medical schools anymore. So that's a win.
Oh, that is a win. I know Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine has been working on that for 40 years, so
Yes.
that's wonderful. I feel like I keep seeing though every once in a while one kind of crops up and PCRM reports on that and goes after them like the wonderful watchdogs that they are, no pun intended. So let's shift a little bit from some of the heavy stuff to the rescue story of Hammy. How did you get him?
So I signed up as a volunteer on the Beagle Freedom Project website. And I basically just bugged them for months because they're on the West Coast. And I just thought, well, maybe there's going to be a rescue on the East Coast. Because once I decided I wanted to foster one of these dogs, I was just completely set on it. And and then I heard that there would be a rescue, and this was July 2013. And I was also told that once we set the date, it could change. It could, the lab might decide we don't want to let the dogs go. But it did happen. There were 7 dogs released at the same time from this lab in Virginia, and they were all named after the founding fathers. So he was Alexander Hamilton, and there was a George Washington and a James Madison, Ben Franklin. And so I'm just picturing all of these sweet beagles. And so we met in the backyard of a donor in Potomac, Maryland, and we just watched these dogs sniff around and we watched their personalities come out a little bit. One of them was running around the perimeter of the yard, and others were just very shy and kind of kept to themselves. And then I brought him home for his first night out of the lab.
Oh. And tell us about him and about your relationship. Tell us your favorite Hammy story.
Oh my gosh. I love road trips, and so, I like to say we liked road trips. We drove across the country several times. I had a grandmother who was in Southern California, and he just was always game. Sometimes I think these new experiences made him a little bit nervous at first, but I just kind of kept pushing him, and I had told him before I adopted him, I do a lot of travel writing. We're going to need to travel. You're going to have to be very brave. And he completely rallied. And, in the beginning, we would stop at a hotel and he would just be very nervous. He'd be sitting on the bed shaking, and I couldn't leave his side. And then, thinking back to the reporting for this book in the last several years, we'd get to a hotel and he'd jump on the bed and he'd jump from one queen bed to the other queen bed, and I'd hide treats around the room and he'd zip around, and sometimes I'd even take him into the little hotel gym because I was up early before anyone was there, and I'd hide treats around the gym. And he he was just so much more confident. People who hadn't seen him in years would see him again and say, "Oh my gosh, I can't believe this is the same dog." But we were just incredibly bonded. I loved him so much, and I think I think that somehow he knew that this was, I don't love saying that he knew I rescued him, because there was so much more involved in him getting out of the lab, but I do know that him ending up in my life was wonderful for both of us.
Well, for those watching on YouTube, I'm just showing the picture of the book, Lab Dog, a Beagle and His Human Investigate the Surprising World of Animal Research. And you have a lovely one word says it all from Dr. Jane Goodall, remarkable. And I can ditto that having read this book. It is truly remarkable, the book and also the relationship. So, talk to us a little bit about the writing process, because to go into what goes on in these labs, it's not writing a happy story. How did you do that? How did you take care of yourself during the process?
Yeah, it was hard, and I got to the point where I thought nothing would surprise me anymore, and yet um, it kept surprising me. And I think the number one way I took care of myself was to just work out every morning. I mean, even when I was working such long days, 7 days a week, digging into this research, reading really dense technical stuff before bed. It was very intense, but I just made sure every morning to get up and do my swim or do my paddleboard or bike and just kind of clear my head. um, that definitely helped. And then of course Hammy was there. He was my, live-in therapy dog. And every time I looked at him, I realized I can't stop. I can't stop telling this story. This is who I'm doing it for. And nobody knows this is happening. I think it's really important as a journalist to throw some light on this and get it out of the shadows and make sure that we know, as as citizens, as individuals, we know what's happening so we can make a choice about how we vote and what we say to our representatives and how we purchase things. So the writing was hard, but I had this North Star that kind of kept me in check the whole time. And my mother said something interesting because she can be she is very sensitive to these kind of things, and I want her to be able to read the book. And she said, if these dogs can go through what they did, the least we can do is read about it. And I hope that my love story with Hammy, and I hope that the way I wrote it makes it accessible to a lot of people. And the way that I the way that I created the narrative and curated these examples. I mean, this is not an academic book of examples of animal experimentation. It's something that I hope is easier to read than
Oh, it's a page turner. I mean, I'm seriously, it is a wonderful, wonderful book. And yes, there are certainly sad facts, reality, but you don't dwell there. And there's always the hope because you've got Hammy by your side, and this is what can happen for these individuals. And there are people out there doing this work every day. So even though it is going on, terrible things, but there are people combating the terrible things, and you are certainly one of them. So I think the whole investigative journalism process is very interesting to those of us on the outside. And I'd be interested in what kind of roadblocks you met when you were trying to get some of this insider information about what goes on in these labs. I doubt that you were welcomed with open arms and given all the information you asked for the first time you asked. Can you tell us about that?
you are correct. Yeah, I'm still waiting to hear back from a lot of people. I'll say that. The research community was more closed than not, but fortunately, I was able to talk to a couple of researchers who not only opened up to me, but opened up their homes to me. And Hammy and I went to visit them, which was wonderful. But in general, researchers either told me they couldn't talk about it, or the people who were, at their universities, the communications office said that that won't be possible, or I just didn't hear back. The biomedical research lobbying organizations or associations often didn't respond to me. So, really what I had to do, and I listened recently to an interview with the investigative journalist and author Will Potter, and he talked about how, at some of these news organizations, they're cutting budgets, and the first thing to go is investigative journalism, and how there's so much more of a reliance on nonprofit organizations for things like, documents. And so, I mean, PETA, for example, has done so many FOIA requests, Freedom of Information Act requests. And so they were wonderful sharing documents with me. Rise for Animals was amazing. I had some people help me file some FOIAs, but really I relied so much on the work that already had been done by these animal rights organizations. And that was critical because that allowed me to see things that I wasn't hearing directly from labs or from breeders like in Vigo. Um, but yeah, there were a lot of closed doors. I'm just really thankful for the ones that they cracked open and the people that were willing to talk. That was really brave. I think researchers are scared of talking. They're scared of being targeted and harassed, and that's a real fear. It's not just something from the 80s and 90s. They often have their homes visited by protesters, and I feel for them. That would be scary.
So explain to us the kind of grammar of this industry. So there's a lot to it. So there are companies that breed the animals, and then there are facilities that are only about animal testing to try to determine certain things. And then there are pharmaceutical companies and others that have animals that they're experimenting on in their facilities. I think it's just kind of overwhelming. Like, where do we go? How does it work? Because you're talking about people that are protesting in that, and God bless them. But to really know how to approach this issue as an individual who cares, I think we need to understand the setup. Can you help us with that a little bit?
Course. So the breeders, and this was really surprising to me because I was picturing kind of small backyard breeders that were selling to labs. They're not small or in the backyard. They are giant industrial, they call them farms, like beagle farms. Um, not that different from when you think of factory farming. So in Vigo had, 5,000 for many years. Ridgeland Farms has more than 3,000 in Wisconsin. Marshall in upstate New York has more than 20,000, which I can't picture that many vehicles. It's crazy. And of course, you can't get individual care. You can't even get care for groups of hundreds of them with that many. So the breeders breed all these dogs and other animals, and they sell them to labs. And the labs they could be universities. They're often universities who where researchers are doing basic research, where they have a hypothesis or scientific question they want to get answered, and they're experimenting. They're doing something on an animal to see how a drug affects something in the body, or what happens, if an animal's sick and then you give them this chemical. So that there's the labs at universities, there's labs at pharmaceutical companies, which these are companies that also didn't respond to me because unlike the cosmetics industry, which is very happy to say, yes, we're cruelty free, the pharmaceutical companies, even when they're moving away from animals, they they're not eager to talk because that means that they've used a lot of animals in the past, and they just, from what I understand, don't want to talk about that at all. We don't get drugs and they say tested on animals or not tested on animals. They just are. Um, and then there are CROs, which are contract research organizations, and those are hired sometimes by pharmaceutical companies or other companies, like maybe a pesticide company that doesn't want to do the testing in-house. So they hire one of these CROs to have a lab of animals and to do the experiments. And I don't know that there's much an individual can do in terms of the breeders, other than going to these protests or writing to their local representatives about not wanting to have these facilities in their neighborhoods, in their towns. Um, and that's really a good suggestion for anyone, because all of these things fall under could fall under legislation. And I think anybody who wants change to happen can reach out to their local or state representatives and say, we don't want these facilities. We want some laws against animal research and testing, and we really want more money and more funding going to the alternatives, because there are a lot of innovators out there doing cool things. And, we're a really smart society. I mean, we humans have so much brain power. And um, everything that I hear from people that are working on these alternatives is that we're not there yet in terms of having a full scale model of a human to test drugs and chemicals in, but we can test things to see how they affect the liver or the kidneys or the lungs. And, remember, it's not in these alternatives, we're not looking for an alternative to the beagle or alternative to the mouse. What we want to do is model the human, because most of these drugs and pesticides, we're looking at how it affects human health. Unless it's something for dog health, in which case we've got great clinical trials that happen with dogs and some other animals. And in that case, those are pets that live at home, and they can go in for clinical trials, and hopefully that will help them, or it will help future generations of those animals.
So I think about animal laboratory use in kind of three groups, and this may just be me being simplistic, but I know there's a lot of testing on rodents, probably millions. It's very easy for people to write off rodents because a lot of us are skittish if a mouse runs across the floor, um, and yet, having had pet mice in my life and knowing people who have had pet rats, they are incredible beings. They have personalities, they're loving. I know even scientifically, it's been shown in the case of rats, they're very moral. They will sacrifice themselves for another rat or even someone of another species. So we've got that group. Then we have the dogs, and then we have the non-human primates. And I know there's work going on now to try to get a non-human primate building facility in South Georgia not built. And it's a wonderful, wonderful effort where PETA and the townspeople in this rural southern town are in alignment. And evidently, the other side is doing all this messaging of, don't hang out with those PETA people. They're going to come after your chickens. And, maybe they will, but not today. Today, they're trying to do something that everybody agrees is not right. So, as you look at my simplistic idea of this, these are the beings who are in these facilities, why do they pick certain animals for certain things? And particularly to your message, what are they using dogs for?
So you're right, they use millions of mice. One estimate is actually more than 100 million mice a year, mice and rats. So 100 million rodents a year, which is just an astronomical number. Um, and, mice, for example, breed very quickly, and they're a lot cheaper than dogs. So a researcher, if they're trying to learn something about a lifespan in a very short amount of time, they might use a mouse, or see how a chemical affects affects an animal during their life. Dogs still have a shorter lifespan than us, so if they're doing aging studies, which are happening on dogs, they don't have to wait 90 years to see how something affects a human, if it were ethical to test something on a human. They use dogs a lot for cardiovascular research because their hearts and that cardiovascular system is similar to ours. I know that they use them for diabetes research, and so in that case, the researcher is feeding the dogs basically a diet of junk food and then euthanizing them to look at their organs and their tissues to see how it might have affected them. Um, Maybe they're looking for a new diabetes drug or treatment. Um, they're also used, going back to the pesticides. Right now, the EPA requires pesticides to be tested on a rodent and a dog. So in that case, there's a very set structure. I think it's like 32 dogs, and they're broken into different dose ranges. So, one group might have a low dose, medium dose, high dose, and then a control group. And they get various doses of this pesticide, this chemical. And then again, they're looking at their tissues and organs after they're euthanized. And they are still used for drugs as well, as are some primates. It's also important to remember that the Animal Welfare Act, which is the law that we have in this country that protects animals, only covers a very small number of animals, or a very small percentage of animals that are used in research. It does not cover any rodents. It does not cover any fish. And that is the vast majority of animals used. Dogs are probably less than 1% of all the animals used, and mice and rats are more than 95%. So, what that means is that labs that are only working with mice, not only is it cheaper, but they don't have to submit numbers. They don't have to say how many mice they're using. They don't have to say whether they were in pain or not. And I think that's a big problem because we don't know that number. We don't know how those individual mice and these moral rats are doing and how they're feeling and how many of them have pain that hasn't been um, where they're not given drugs to feel better. So the the primates and pigs and dogs and rabbits and guinea pigs, those are covered. So those numbers do have to be reported to the USDA, which kind of oversees the Animal Welfare Act.
When you were talking about feeding the animals junk food and then looking to see what happened to them, my first thought is we already know that. I, I- there seems to be so much repetition. I mean, I'm an abolitionist in terms of experimentation on animals. People would say, well, what if they could come up with a cure for cancer by, doing things to animals? I mean, I've had cancer. It wasn't bad. I had a little lump and it hadn't spread, so I don't mean to say I went through any kind of vast suffering. But I've been close enough to that C word to know how scary it is. I do not want to save myself based on the suffering of others. So, what can we do legislatively or in an activist format to say, at least don't repeat yourself? And that would seem to cut these studies down by maybe 90%.
I know, I'm not a scientist, and so it's hard for me to fully understand the scientific process, but the repetition is such a big part of it. They need to know that they get the same results over and over to make sure something's working. But we need to do that without animals. We need to do that with methods that are more relevant to human health. And there's so many exciting ways to do that. I mean, we've got AI, which we know is incredibly powerful. There's computer modeling. We also have a ton of human data, and I don't know too much about this, but I mean, just think about people who are wearing Apple Watches, right? I mean, it tracks so much. It tracks our steps, it tracks our breathing and our sleep, and that data is out there. And I just believe there's so much we can do, and probably a lot that's already happening in terms of using human data. And that's what we want. I mean, we don't want to have a model that's another species that's not like us that is suffering,
Mm.
and that's also not that predictive. I mean, there's
Yes.
a statistic on drugs. More than 95% of the drugs that show promise in animals fail for humans, like fail in human trials, because either it's toxic or it's just not effective.
Mm.
So that means it's a lot of work and animal lives that is all for naught, and time and money. And so if we turn more funding to the human relevant methods, I think, and hope and feel optimistic that we'll have more success.
Yes. I always remember the story about thalidomide, the mid 20th century drug that was given to pregnant women for morning sickness, and then they gave birth to children without arms and legs. And when this started happening after a full complement of animal testing, they went back to do more animal testing. It's like, excuse me, why not just take the drug off the market? It's harming humans. But they went back and they tested and they tested and they tested until they found one breed of Australian jackrabbit that had the same resulting offspring deformities that happened in humans. And I mean, this was, you know, 70, 80 years ago, and it just seems like we don't learn. I know that there's a lot of financial betterment to a lot of people involved. These are very powerful industries. They're very entrenched. And I was also interested in when you were talking about what dogs are used for a lot, heart disease, diabetes. These are probably the two number one conditions that we can say unequivocally respond to a whole food plant-based diet. So it just, oh, it's just so nonsensical and so difficult. And sometimes when you're faced with the nonsensical and the difficult, you just need to hang out with a dog. So tell us about Hammy and tell us what he taught you.
Hmm. Oh my gosh. I think that I, I tend to be pretty adventurous and I like exploring. And I think that he encouraged me to even do more of that because I know he liked exploring. I mean, once he learned to use his nose, he really loved sniffing and loved new places. And since I've lost him, I think about that all the time. And sometimes when I'm just kind of home and not feeling like getting out, I kind of channel that energy and get myself out to a park or go see something new. But, I think that knowing his background and knowing how resilient dogs are in general, I think we have a lot to learn from them just about getting over things in the past and moving on and of course being in the moment and all the good things that dogs show us.
And I am so sorry for your loss. I know that whenever we invite a dog into our lives, uh, the almost certain likelihood is that one day they will leave them. And that's really, really hard. And yet the relationship, I think is well worth the grief. And we wouldn't have the grief if it weren't for the relationship. So let's talk a little bit about you. Let's kind of end this on a happy note. So you're doing the vegan thing, which is really cool. And so what do you like to cook? What do you like to eat?
Well, I'll tell you what I'm most excited about now. Are you familiar with Rancho Gordo beans?
I'm not
They're
familiar
air
with
they're so
Rancho
they're
Gordo beans.
they're heirloom dried beans and actually the beagle named George Washington, his mother told me about these beans. And so years ago, I got on the waiting list because they have a quarterly shipment of beans. You kind of get a box with surprise beans and they're really good. I mean, some are huge and they just have these, beautiful designs on them, designs as though we designed them. And anyway, so there was a waiting list for this to be part of the Bean Club. And this summer I got an email, and I mean this is probably 4 years after I signed up. And it said, good news, you're at the top of the list now. You can join the Bean Club. And I had literally like 24 hours to decide. And of course, I signed up. But now I get every quarter, I get a box of six bags of different beans, and they come with great recipes. And I'm just so excited about this because, I love beans. And the last time we got little black caviar lentils.
Ooh.
And, it's a great way to get protein and to, if I don't eat enough foods like that, I tend to get hungry and snack on too many sweets, and that is definitely my downfall. So I really love lentils and beans, and so this is the new exciting food in my life. But generally, I start my day with a good green smoothie with lots of good stuff in it, and I like to have leftovers for lunch. So whatever I made for dinner the night before, hopefully I'm eating for lunch. I don't have to take too much time off work.
Well, I love the talk about beans because beans are in trouble. There are people out there talking, about beans are no longer good. Except that in all the countries where people live long and do well in later life, they're all eating beans. And then there's some talk about taking beans off the plate, the USDA plate, taking off beans as a protein source, I guess to pump up more of the animal food industries. So yeah,
Oh
we get
no.
out there with our beans. So, and we have to get to the bookstore or over to Amazon or wherever you buy your books and get ourselves a copy of Lab Dog. But for people who are saying, "Oh, I know it's a good book and I think she's a good person, but I don't want to read icky, nasty stuff," tell us why this is a really beautiful, readable book despite the subject matter.
Well, I'll just say again that if my mother can read this, I think anybody can read it. And I think that as individuals, it's important for us to be informed because I mean, this is why we make choices on eating and buying, and this is the world and the country we want to live in, and we do have an impact on that. And I don't think that there's another book out there like this that's not, it's not an academic book, it's not an activist book. I really tried hard to take a journalist approach and introduce people to folks on both sides of the debate because it's just not a black and white issue. It's complicated. Some people will say it's black and white, but there's a lot of nuances that I hope I conveyed and that I think are important in all of our decision making processes and just as individuals. And I want you to read the book because I want everybody to know Hammy. He's a special guy.
Yes. Well, and it was wonderful to get to know him and to get to know you better. You and I had met, but then in the book, there was really a depth of who you are. And you're not only a wonderful, committed person, you're a totally delightful person. So, movie rights, I mean, any thought of turning this into a film? Is your publisher going to work on that?
Oh gosh, I need to ask my publisher to get on that.
Yeah, because I could really see that in that kind of format. And we know people are saying, well, people don't read as much as they used to. Well, thank God for Audible. Is it going to be Audible? Are you going to do a audiobook version?
Hope so. I hope to know that in the next yeah, in the next month or two.
Yeah, fight for that because a
Yes.
lot of people, that's what they want. But I'm thinking the movie too. So I'll help y'all visualize a little bit on that. So I just have one more question for you. But before I do want to do a shout out to our sponsor helping to make the Main Street Vegan podcast possible and also helping to make a little bit more vibrant health and complete nutrition possible for people who are eating healthy already, eating plant-based, and that is complement. And complement, excuse me, are wonderful supplementary products for people who are already vegan. So, founded by Matt Frazier, the meat free athlete, Dr. Pamela Ferguson, wonderful PhD dietitian, Dr. Joel Kahn, cardiologist. These are multivitamins and a wonderful protein powder, mostly pea, some other stuff, purest protein powder I know of. It's a great company. The website is lovecomplement.com. And if you choose to make a purchase and you put in the discount code Main Street in all capital letters, you'll get 10% off not only your first order, but my understanding is because I'm a grandfathered in affiliate, you'll get that 10% off forever and ever and ever as long as you choose to use these wonderful products, which I use and really value. So, as we look at Lab Dog and all of the work that you're doing now and that you're going to be doing around the country presenting on this issue. What can we do? What can we do as humans? I remember years and years ago, it was 1980. I was researching my college thesis. So I was in the UK studying vegans. And I remember that so many of these really dedicated vegans, people who had started on this process back in the 1940s, one of the things they did was everything possible to avoid pharmaceutical drugs. So they were funding the Nature Cure College and the Nature Cure Clinic in London. And here we are today. We're a much more drugged society. And I certainly, wouldn't be telling anyone to stop taking the medication that their doctor has prescribed for them. But how can we live our lives in a way that will help experimentation on dogs and other animals become a thing of the past?
Yeah, I love this question because there are things we can do that make a difference. And I was reminded when I was interviewing people about the cosmetics shift to non-animals that a lot of that came from the public who, were not happy about it. Um, and they spoke up. So we can do the same. We can, of course, write to companies and write to our representatives, and that does make a difference. And what I've started doing in my life, really after I adopted Hammy, I I started really thinking about the products I was buying. And in a lot of cases, I didn't need to buy them. Sometimes it was just a matter of like, oh, do I need this bug spray? I hate mosquitoes. I'm a magnet for them, but I just don't want to buy another product because now I know the history of that product. Um, and in other cases, it took a little bit more work to not buy something and instead change my lifestyle. For example, I was having some stomach issues, and the doctor, of course, said, "Okay, here's your prescription. Go get it filled." And I said, "Well, can I just try to change this through my diet?" And I went on a very strict diet for a few months, and that made a difference. And I've tried to stick to that diet. Doctors are very quick to write out prescriptions, and in some cases, they're really needed. I mean, I've had surgeries, I've needed painkillers. I'm not anti-pharmaceuticals at all, but I also know there's a lot of elective drugs, over-the-counter drugs, things that we want to stock our medicine cabinets with just to have them on hand. And, I've just started looking at that very differently because if I need something, I will get a prescription filled, but I guess my need has changed a little bit because um, I realize there are other things that we can do, which are healthier options anyway, in many cases. Rather than just popping a pill the first hint of a headache or an itch or so um, I guess that's the big thing. And then just, the drugs and the pesticides and really products in general. I've really begun buying fewer of those because, I don't know that dogs are tested for some of these other chemicals that are in everything. I mean, the forever chemicals, the plastics. I don't know that dogs or what animals are used for those, but at some point, these chemicals are often tested, and I just want to be a much smaller consumer of these things.
I completely agree. And I must say that I learned from your book about the hand sanitizers. I didn't realize they were classed as pesticides. And I know during the pandemic, especially early on when they didn't know how COVID-19 was spread and, we were washing our groceries and all of that. But they were saying, don't use these natural essential oil-based hand sanitizers because they're not good enough. But I'm back to those, having read your book and knowing the history of that. And I think one of the beautiful things about the whole vegan lifestyle, even for people who are not 100% completely vegan yet, but are just on this road to live in a kinder fashion, as is we learn something about something and we change that. And that moves us along just a little bit. And I thank you very much for, even after 41 years as a vegan, gosh, it'll be 42 next month. You are helping move me along. So thank you. Thank you so much. The book is beautiful. Hammy is beautiful. You are beautiful. Thank you for all you do. Thank you for writing this book. And may all of them be freed.
Oh, Victoria, thank you so much. This has just been such a delightful conversation, and I really appreciate all of your work.
Oh, well, I'm just so happy to be a proud owner of your book because that's one I'm going to go back to. And it's funny sometimes too. You're talking about you and Hammy out there doing this research. Some of the hotels you stayed in were not the Ritz.
They were not.
Yeah. So anybody has who has ever stayed in a less than wonderful hotel will have some really fun relating as you meet your lab dog.
Well, he really didn't care. He was nice, He wasn't picky.
That's great. That's the wonderful thing about dogs.
Yeah, as long
And,
as they're
and
with
they
you.
and they don't care if you're wearing makeup or if you have a bad hair day or if society thinks you're beautiful or not. They think you're beautiful. Ah,
Yeah.
one of these days. Thank
Yeah.
you. Thank you so much, Melanie. Thank you, listeners. So, what are we going to do now? I'd say let's go out and make Main Street vegan.